जिंदाबाद अपनी MSO जिंदाबाद 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 अपनी.
You have to hold your wealth. And this had social consequences. That meant, since you are austere, you have to make investment. You will reinvest in the society. You will reinvest in business. The second idea in imagination was transcendence. Transcendence in Calvinism simply meant that God has created this earth and created human beings, but has transcended the earth. He is not involved in the day-to-day management of human beings. He's not telling you to pick up the leaf or go to the shop or fill the petrol in your car or your bike. God is not involved in the everyday management of your life. He has created the earth. He knows your destination. He knows what is going to happen to everyone. And he has transcended it. So transcendence. That meant you could interpret, society interprets it, that he has given you the liberty to have a scientific aptitude for yourself, rather than be. So under the Catholic system, you did not really have a scientific aptitude. The priestly class told you to confine yourself to the study of the Bible, and that's it. But here, under Calvinism, you could develop a scientific aptitude to know about the everyday life, which was very different. Scientific aptitude led to the development of technology, whether it was in Harvard, whether it was in Oxford, whether it was in Cambridge. The third key idea in imaginary was the idea of the calling. The idea of the calling was related to individual. The calling meant, for example, you could consider my calling is to become a businessman, or my calling in life is to become a carpenter. My calling in life is to become an engineer or a doctor. Someone could be working as a farmer, but would interpret, may not feel very happy about it. Or someone's calling could be to be a shoemaker. Someone could be happy, but another person may not be happy. But, religion would make that person feel, or her feel, that that's my calling. And because of religious obligation, one would feel, but that's my calling, so I have to be happy. So that's the calling. And since that's your calling, that created division of labor in the society. You accepted it as your calling. It created division of labor in society, and it disciplined you as a workforce. It prevented unionization. Since it was your calling, you couldn't protest. You were a disciplined workforce. And it created hardworking workers out of you. That essentially created the spirit of capitalism. And it led to massive developments. It also created the grounds for women to come out and join the workforce, whether it was in North America or in Europe. These investments went into universities, into churches, into libraries. So if you were traveling across the northeastern part of America or across places where there is Cambridge and Oxford, you would see small libraries everywhere. These people who believe in Calvinism made investments in libraries, public libraries, and in churches. And, it created the grounds for public education, scientific aptitude, and technology. But this sort of raises the question, is the West really secular? And there are contradictions about it, After all, Christianity did not exist in harmony with other religions. You have to remember, while the Arabs were there in Europe, they coexisted with the Jews and the Christians. But the Christians drove the Muslims out, and they conducted genocide of the Jews, right? It is not simply Hitler that killed the Jews. The pogrom of the Jews took place in Russia, and the Jews were tormented throughout Europe. So one cannot really say that, the West has been very, very receptive to other religions. This is a really important debate, the Bruno Bauer versus Karl Marx on the Jewish question. And this is important even in the context of India. You just have to replace the word Jew with Muslims. So just if you sort of look at this debate, according to Bruno Bauer, Jews could only achieve political emancipation if they relinquished their particular religious consciousness. Political emancipation requires a secular state that did not leave any space, not and space, any space for social identities such as religion. Political emancipation thus requires the abolition of religion. So many in India sort of also argue, Muslims need to give up their religious identity to really integrate this idea of mainstream, that Muslims are not in the mainstream. That's why there is so much problem. Only if they were in the so-called mainstream, all these problems would disappear. And to this idea, Karl Marx responds brilliantly. Karl Marx, the philosopher, basically argues, Karl Marx rejects and critiques Bauer's view that the nature of the Jewish religion prevented assimilation of Jews. Karl Marx says this is a nonsensical kind of an argument. Instead, Karl Marx challenged and repudiated Bauer's very formulation of the idea of emancipation. He felt that, what is emancipation? The context under which you are framing the idea of emancipation itself is problematic. The way you're framing the very notion of emancipation, first of all, itself is completely out of whack, and you have to reframe the very idea of emancipation to sort of rethink of it. The idea that, just because you are of a minority religion, that you have to give up your identity, that your identity itself is a problem, is not simply what the BJP or the right wing is saying. I don't want to get into it, but even some of the key figures whom some of us respect highly also have said, I don't want to even mention the name. It will create, my friend Mohibul Haq has said, don't say anything that can create controversy. So I'll not even mention the name. Some of the fathers of our constitution have said very stupid things, so I'll not get into it. But, Marx argued that more importantly, Marx argued that Bauer is mistaken in his assumption that in a secular state, religion will no longer play a prominent role in social life. As an example, he refers to the pervasiveness of religion in the United States, which, unlike Prussia, had no state religion. In Marx's analysis, The secular state is not opposed to religion, but rather assumes it. So what Marx is basically saying is that, there are states which basically claim that they are secular. They claim themselves to be secular, but religion becomes so pervasive that even though they claim themselves to be secular, but religion permeates into the very fiber of its system. So, for example, why is Sunday a holiday in Europe? Because people go to church, right? But they call themselves secular. Why are there holidays, long holidays during December? Because it's time for Christmas. We don't call it Christmas holidays. So Karl Marx basically says that, it's okay to call yourself secular, but you are able to call yourself secular because you don't need to think about it, because it is there in your system. So it's a very important debate and a very, very nicely done way to sort of think through it. So Marx essentially challenges the notion of secularism. And the secular challenge, and when we think about secularism particularly, it's sort of embedded in contradiction, because it has to be thought through in the context of nation and nationality. And the very idea of nation is embedded in contradiction, because nation as such is only an imagined community. We often tend to think of nation as somehow being sacrosanct, nations as somehow being, a given idea. But nation essentially is an imagined community. Let me explain what I mean by the idea of nation being an imagined community. The idea of nation and nationality is, first of all, a Eurocentric, a Western idea. It emerged in Europe because it meant homogeneity in terms of racial identity, in terms of language, in terms of food culture. So a French nation meant everyone spoke the French language, everyone had the same kind of food culture, everyone was Catholic, and hence everyone was French. That is what meant when someone said, French nationality. Similarly was the idea of being British. Same was the idea of being Belgian or Austrian. So it made sense to them in the context of Europe at a certain point of time. And the idea of nation and nationality got entrenched through certain apparatuses, state apparatuses. I would classify those apparatuses as twofold. There were repressive apparatuses of the state and the ideological apparatuses of the state. You needed the army, the police, the judiciary to enforce discipline in you, to beat you up, to believe that you belong to a state. And you needed the schooling system, the universities, the church, the family, to inculcate the idea of the state and nationality, that you have to die for the state to protect it. And through the combination of ideological and repressive apparatuses of the state, nation as an imagined community got entrenched in our imagination. So the real idea of state